Dr. Elena Vasquez rubbed her tired eyes as she stared at the glowing screen in her small cabin aboard the research ship Meridian. It was past midnight, ship time, but she couldn't sleep. Something felt wrong about this mission, and she couldn't shake the feeling. 3 weeks ago, she had been working quietly in her lab on Earth, studying tiny organisms that lived in impossible places. Hot springs, deep ocean trenches, places where nothing should survive. It was peaceful work that she loved. Then came the call from the Galactic Research Council. They needed her expertise for an important mission to study plant life on a farming world called Kepler 442b. The mission seemed perfect, a quiet planet with gentle weather known for growing the best crops in 3-star systems. Elena packed her equipment, said goodbye to her small apartment, and boarded the Meridian with excitement. Finally, she would see an alien world with her own eyes. But tonight, everything changed. Elena had been trying to access the ship's database to learn more about the plants she would study. She was good with computers, maybe too good. While searching through the files, she found a folder that seemed out of place. It was heavily encrypted, hidden deep in the navigation system. Her curiosity got the better of her. Using skills she had learned years ago in college, she carefully broke through the security. What she found made her blood turn cold. The real destination wasn't Kepler 442b at all. The navigation files showed their true target, Xerion Prime. Even Elena, who spent most of her time buried in research, knew that name. Every space traveler did. Xerion Prime was the planet that swallowed expeditions whole. Ships went there and never came back. The few emergency signals that ever made it out told stories that gave people nightmares. Elena's hands shook as she read through the mission files. According to the documents, she wasn't just a researcher on this trip. She was listed as the lead specialist, the person responsible for collecting samples from one of the most dangerous worlds in the galaxy. But she had never agreed to this. Nobody had told her about Xerion Prime. She had been trained to study organisms, in safe laboratory conditions, not to survive on a planet that had earned the nickname the Graveyard of Explorers. The worst part was reading about what they were really after. Not peaceful farming plants, but something called void spores. The files described them as potentially revolutionary for medicine, but every previous attempt to collect them had ended in disaster. Elena felt sick to her stomach. She had been lied to, manipulated into joining what might be a suicide mission. But why her? Why would anyone think she could survive where trained military teams had failed? Unable to contain her panic any longer, Elena decided to confront Captain Morrison. She found him in his private office, reviewing star charts. He was a tall man with graying hair and kind eyes, someone she had come to trust over the past 3 weeks. "Captain," Elena said, her voice barely steady, "we need to talk." Morrison looked up and immediately noticed her pale face and shaking hands. He sighed deeply, as if he had been expecting this conversation. "You found the real navigation files," he said quietly. It wasn't a question. "How could you lie to me?" Elena demanded, trying to keep her voice down. "Xerion Prime? Are you trying to get us all killed?" Morrison stood up and moved to his small window, looking out at the stars rushing. "Aye, sit down, Elena. You deserve to know the truth." She remained standing, too angry and scared to relax. "The Galactic Research Council came to me 6 months ago," Morrison began. "They had been studying the failed missions to Xerion Prime, trying to understand what went wrong. Every team they sent was made up of soldiers, pilots, and standard researchers. All of them died within days of landing. So they decided to send more people to die?" Elena asked bitterly. "No," Morrison said, turning to face her. "They realized they had been approaching the problem wrong. Xerion Prime isn't just physically dangerous. According to the few reports that made it back, the planet affects people's minds. It makes them paranoid, violent, unable to think clearly. Elena felt a chill run down her spine. What does that have to do with me? Your work with extremophile organisms, Morrison explained. You've spent years studying life forms that survive, in conditions that would kill everything else. More importantly, you've developed an unusual resistance to biological toxins and psychoactive compounds. The Council believes this makes you uniquely qualified to resist whatever affects people's minds on Zerion Prime. But I never agreed to this, Elena protested. I signed up to study plants on a safe farming world. Morrison's expression grew sad. I know, and I'm sorry. The Council was afraid that if they told researchers the truth, no one would volunteer. They've been trying to get those void spores for 20 years. Apparently, initial tests suggest they could cure diseases that have plagued humanity for centuries. Elena sank into a chair, overwhelmed by the enormity of what she was facing. So you're telling me that I'm humanity's best hope for surviving, a planet that kills everyone who goes there? I'm telling you that you're our only hope, Morrison said gently. And I'm also telling you that if you want to turn back, I'll find a way to make it happen, even if it means defying the Council's direct orders. Elena stared at the floor, her mind racing. She thought about all the people who might be saved by the medical breakthroughs the void spores could provide. She also thought about the expedition, teams who had died horrible deaths trying to retrieve them. How long do I have to decide? She asked finally. We reach Zerion Prime in 4 days, Morrison replied. But Elena, whatever you decide, you should know that I'll do everything in my power to bring you home safely. That's a promise. As Elena walked back to her cabin, she realized that her quiet life as a researcher was over. Whether she chose to face the dangers of Zerion Prime or demand to return to Earth, nothing would ever be the same. The question now was whether she had the courage to risk everything for the chance to save countless lives. The stars outside her window seemed colder now, and Elena wondered if she would live to see them again. Elena spent the next 2 days learning everything she could about Zerion Prime. What she discovered made her wish she had never heard of the place. Captain Morrison gave her access to all the classified files about previous missions. Elena sat in the ship's small library, reading report after report of expeditions that had gone terribly wrong. Each file painted a picture of a world that seemed designed to destroy anyone who dared to land on it. The first thing that struck her was how the planet looked from space. Unlike Earth with its blue oceans and white clouds, Zerion Prime was wrapped in dark, swirling storms that never stopped moving. These weren't ordinary weather patterns. The storms created a thick blanket around the entire planet that blocked most sunlight from reaching the surface. But the storms did more than just make the planet dark. They produced powerful electromagnetic fields that interfered with all electronic equipment. This meant that once a team landed on the surface, they couldn't communicate with their ship. No radio calls, no emergency beacons, no way to call for help. Elena read the account of the first expedition, led by Commander Rodriguez 15 years ago. His team of 6 military specialists had landed near what appeared to be a calm area. Their last transmission came just 3 hours after touchdown. Rodriguez reported that their equipment was malfunctioning and that strange sounds were coming from the forest around them. Then, silence. The rescue team that went looking for them found their landing craft empty. All the supplies were still there, but the crew had vanished without a trace. The only clue was Rodriguez's personal log found inside the ship. His final entry, written in shaky handwriting, simply said, "The trees are watching us. They know we're here." Elena felt her skin crawl as she read similar accounts from other missions. Each expedition seemed to follow the same pattern. Teams would land successfully, but within hours, something would start going wrong. Equipment would fail, team members would report strange sights and sounds, and then all contact would be lost. The few emergency beacons that were ever activated told an even more disturbing story. The recordings captured team members arguing with each other, accusing their colleagues of betrayal and sabotage. In one recording, Elena heard a woman screaming that her partner was trying to poison her food. In another, a man was convinced that alien creatures were wearing the faces of his teammates. Dr. Chen, the ship's medical officer, helped Elena understand what was happening. The planet's atmosphere contains unusual chemical compounds, Chen explained as they reviewed the data together. These chemicals affect the human brain in ways we don't fully understand. They seem to cause paranoia, hallucinations, and aggressive behavior in most people. Elena studied the atmospheric analysis reports. The air on Xerion Prime was breathable, but it was filled with microscopic particles that came from the planet's unique plant life. When humans breathed these particles, they entered the bloodstream and traveled to the brain. Once there, they began to change how people thought and felt. "It's like the planet is slowly driving visitors insane," Chen said grimly. "The longer someone stays on the surface, the worse the effects become." Most expedition members showed signs of mental breakdown within 6 to 8 hours. But the psychological effects weren't even the worst part. Elena learned that the planet's surface was covered with a type of plant life that had never been seen anywhere else in the galaxy. These weren't ordinary trees and flowers. They were carnivorous organisms that had evolved to hunt and consume anything that moved. The reports described forests where the trees could sense movement from incredible distances. When they detected intruders, they would release chemical signals that attracted every predatory plant in the area. Within minutes, a single person walking through the forest could find themselves surrounded by hostile vegetation that moved with purpose and intelligence. One expedition member's helmet camera had captured footage of these plants in action. Elena watched in horror as vines thick as a person's arm reached out to grab the camera operator. The plants moved faster than seemed possible, coordinating their attacks like a pack of wolves. The footage ended abruptly when something large crashed into the camera. Elena also learned about the planet's day and night cycle, which added another layer of danger to any mission. Xerion Prime had an unusual rotation that created periods of complete darkness, lasting 14 hours, followed by only 10 hours of dim, filtered sunlight. During the dark periods, the carnivorous plants became even more active and aggressive. The strangest thing about all these dangers was how they seemed to work together. The storms prevented communication with rescue ships. The atmospheric chemicals made people paranoid and unable to work as a team. The hostile plant life eliminated anyone who survived the psychological effects. It was as if the entire planet was a carefully designed trap. Despite all these terrifying discoveries, Elena found herself becoming more determined rather than more frightened. She began to see patterns in the expedition failures that others might have missed. Every previous team had been made up of military personnel or standard researchers. None of them had her specific background in studying organisms that lived in extreme conditions. Elena started to believe that her years of working with extremophile bacteria and toxic environments might actually give her advantages that previous expeditions had lacked. She had built up resistance to many biological toxins through careful exposure in her laboratory work. More importantly, she understood how hostile organisms behaved and how to avoid triggering their defensive responses. As the Meridian approached Xerion Prime, Elena made her final decision. She would go through with the mission, but not because the Council had tricked her into it. She would go because she genuinely believed she might be the first person with the right combination of skills and knowledge to survive the planet's dangers and return with the void spores. Looking out at the dark, storm-covered world growing larger in the view screen, Elena felt a mixture of terror and excitement. In just a few hours, she would find out if her confidence was justified or if she was about to become another name on the list of people who had vanished into Xerion Prime's hungry embrace. The shuttle bay felt colder than usual as Elena put on her protective gear. Her hands trembled slightly as she checked each piece of equipment one final time. In just 30 minutes, she would be heading down to the most dangerous planet in the galaxy. Captain Morrison had selected 3 crew members to accompany her on the surface mission. Jake Torres was the ship's security chief, a calm man with years of experience in dangerous situations. Maya Chen was their best engineer, someone who could fix almost any piece of equipment under pressure. Sam Rodriguez was their pilot, known for being able to land a shuttle in impossible conditions. Elena looked at her 3 companions as they prepared their gear. These people were trusting her judgment, following her into a place where dozens of trained professionals had disappeared. The weight of that responsibility felt heavier than all her equipment combined. "Remember," Elena addressed the team, "the moment anyone starts feeling strange, you tell the rest of us immediately. Don't try to tough it out. The planet's atmosphere is going to mess with our minds, and we need to watch out for each other." Jake nodded as he checked his scanner. "How will we know if what we're seeing is real or just the planet playing tricks on us?" "We stick together and confirm everything with each other," Elena replied. "If only one person sees or hears something, we treat it as suspicious. Trust your teammates more than your own senses." The shuttle launched from the Meridian at exactly noon ship time. As they descended through Xerion Prime's storm-covered atmosphere, Elena watched the lightning flash all around them. The electromagnetic interference was so strong that their instruments began flickering within minutes. "This is worse than I expected," Sam muttered from the pilot's seat, fighting to keep the shuttle stable. "I'm flying almost blind here." The shuttle shook violently as they dropped through the storm clouds. Elena gripped her seat, watching the instrument panels spark and fail one by one. Through the small window, she caught glimpses of the planet's surface. It looked like a dark jungle covered in strange, twisted trees that seemed to move even though there was no wind. Then disaster struck. A massive bolt of lightning hit the shuttle's right wing. The craft spun out of control, alarms blaring as Sam fought desperately to regain stability. Elena felt her stomach drop as they fell through the sky like a stone. "Hold on!" Sam shouted. "I'm going to try to glide us in." The crash was surprisingly gentle, considering how fast they had been falling. Sam managed to bring the shuttle down, in a small clearing, but the landing was still hard enough to throw everyone forward in their seats. When the dust settled, Elena realized they were alive but stranded. "How bad is the damage?" she asked Maya, who was already checking the shuttle's systems. Maya's face was grim as she looked at her readings. "The main engine is completely fried. Communication array is destroyed. We're not flying out of here." Elena felt her heart sink. According to their original plan, they were supposed to land only 10 kilometers from the Void Spore site. Now, with their instruments damaged, they had no way to know where they were or which direction to go. Jake was examining his portable scanner. "I'm getting some strange readings from that direction," he said, pointing toward a gap in the trees. "Could be the electromagnetic signature we're looking for." They had no choice but to start walking. Elena led the way, using her knowledge of hostile environments to guide them through the alien forest. The trees around them were unlike anything she had ever seen. They had dark, twisted trunks that seemed to pulse with their own inner light, and their branches reached out like grasping fingers. After 2 hours of walking, Maya was the first to show signs that the planet was affecting her mind. She stopped suddenly and stared up at one of the trees. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. Elena listened carefully. "Hear what?" "The music," Maya said with a strange smile. "It's so beautiful, like a symphony." Elena exchanged worried glances with Jake and Sam. There was no music, only the eerie silence of the alien forest. Maya was beginning to hallucinate. Things got worse quickly after that. Jake started becoming suspicious of everything around them. He kept looking over his shoulder and jumping at shadows that weren't there. When Sam accidentally stepped on a dry branch, Jake spun around with his weapon, ready, convinced they were being followed. "Put that down," Elena said firmly. "There's nothing there. It's just the planet messing with your head." But Jake's eyes were wild with paranoia. "How do I know you're really Elena?" he demanded. "How do I know you haven't been replaced by something from this planet?" Elena realized she was watching the same pattern that had destroyed every previous expedition. Her team was falling apart, turning on each other just like the reports had described. But she also noticed something important. While her teammates were losing their grip on reality, her own mind remained relatively clear. Her years of working with toxic organisms had indeed given her some resistance to the planet's effects. She could feel the chemicals trying to cloud her thoughts, but her body was fighting them off better than her companions. "Listen to me, all of you," Elena said in her most authoritative voice. "I know this is scary, but we have to trust each other. The planet wants us to turn against each other. Don't give it what it wants." She reached into her pack and pulled out breathing masks she had specially designed. "These filters should help reduce the amount of atmospheric chemicals we're inhaling. Put them on now." The masks helped, but not completely. Maya still occasionally talked to invisible friends, and Jake continued to scan the forest suspiciously. Sam seemed to be holding up better, but Elena could see the strain in his eyes. As evening approached, they finally reached their destination. In a small clearing surrounded by the strangest trees Elena had ever seen, they found the remains of previous expeditions. Scattered equipment, abandoned camps, and personal belongings told the story of teams that had made it this far but no further. Elena's blood ran cold when she saw 3 different shuttle crash sites around the clearing. Each one represented a failed mission, people who had died trying to collect the same samples she was now seeking. "Elena!" Sam called out, his voice shaking. "You need to see this." He was standing next to what looked like a makeshift grave marker. Carved into a piece of metal were the names of expedition members from the most recent failed mission, along with a final message. "The spores are not what they seem. Don't trust them. They're watching. They're waiting." Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the planet's cold air. As she looked around the clearing, she began to notice that the trees surrounding them weren't moving randomly. They were all leaning slightly inward, as if they were listening to every word the team spoke. The void spores were somewhere in this clearing, but Elena was starting to wonder if finding them would be a victory or a trap. As darkness began to fall over Zerion Prime, she realized that surviving the night would be their first challenge. Finding the spores and getting off the planet alive would be something else entirely. Elena spent the night watching over her team while they slept fitfully under the alien stars. Every few hours, one of them would wake up screaming about nightmares that seemed too real to be dreams. Maya kept talking about hearing her dead sister, calling for help. Jake mumbled about invisible enemies surrounding their camp. Sam tossed and turned, arguing with people who weren't there. But Elena's mind remained surprisingly clear. She was beginning to understand that her years of working with dangerous organisms had given her more than just physical resistance to toxins. Her brain had learned to recognize when foreign substances were trying to influence her thoughts. She could feel the planet's chemicals working on her mind, but she could also fight back against them. As dawn broke over Zerion Prime, Elena finally saw the void spores for the first time. They grew in a perfect circle in the center of the clearing, looking like nothing she had ever encountered in all her years of studying unusual life forms. Each spore was about the size of a baseball, with a surface that seemed to shift and change color as she watched. They pulsed gently with their own inner light, creating patterns that were almost hypnotic to look at. But there was something wrong with the way they grew. Elena had studied thousands of different organisms, and she had never seen anything that arranged itself in such a perfect geometric pattern. It looked artificial, planned, as if the spores had chosen exactly where to position themselves. "They're beautiful," Maya whispered, staring at the spores with wide eyes. "Look how they glow." Elena noticed that her teammate was walking slowly toward the spore circle without seeming to realize it. "Maya, stop!" Elena called out firmly. "Don't get any closer!" But Maya didn't seem to hear her. She continued walking forward with a dreamy expression on her face, her hand reaching out toward the nearest spore. Elena had to grab her arm and pull her back forcefully. "Let me go," Maya protested. "They're trying to tell me something important." Elena felt a chill run down her spine. She looked at Jake and Sam and saw that they were also staring at the spores with the same fascinated expression. Whatever these organisms were, they were having a powerful effect on her team's minds. Elena decided to study the spores from a safe distance. She set up her equipment and began taking readings, trying to understand what made these organisms so special that people were willing to die for them. What she discovered changed everything she thought she knew about their mission. The spores weren't just producing the psychoactive chemicals that affected people's minds. They were actively communicating with each other using complex electromagnetic signals. Elena's instruments detected a constant stream of information flowing between the spores, like a conversation in a language she couldn't understand. But the most shocking discovery came when Elena realized that the electromagnetic signals weren't limited to the spores in front of her. Her equipment was detecting similar signals coming from all over the planet. The entire surface of Xerion Prime was covered with a vast network of these communicating organisms. Elena sat back in amazement as she processed what this meant. The void spores weren't just random plants growing in this one location. They were part of a planet-wide intelligence, a single enormous organism that used the individual spores like brain cells. Then she made an even more disturbing discovery. Elena began reviewing the data from all the previous expeditions to Xerion Prime, looking for patterns she might have missed. What she found made her hands shake with fear and anger. Every expedition to the planet had followed the same route to reach this exact clearing. Every team had crashed in almost the same location. Every group had faced the same sequence of psychological breakdowns and equipment failures. The pattern was too perfect to be coincidence. Elena realized that the void spores had been manipulating every aspect of these missions from the very beginning. The electromagnetic interference that caused shuttle crashes, the atmospheric chemicals that drove people insane, even the carnivorous plants that attacked intruders. It was all being controlled by the spore network. The spores had been luring expeditions to Xerion Prime for decades, not to be collected, but to study human behavior and learn how to manipulate people more effectively. Every failed mission had taught the spores something new about human psychology and technology. Elena began to understand the true scope of what was happening. The Galactic Research Council hadn't sent these expeditions based on their own scientific interest. They had been influenced by the spores to keep sending people to the planet. The medical research data that made the spores seem so valuable had been planted in human databases by the spores themselves. "Elena," Jake called out, his voice sounding strange. "The spores are trying to communicate with us." Elena looked up to see that all three of her teammates were now standing at the edge of the spore circle, staring down at the glowing organisms with blank expressions. They were no longer fighting the mental effects of the planet. They were embracing them. "They're showing us the truth," Maya said in a dreamy voice. "The spores aren't trying to hurt us. They want to help us become something better." Elena watched in horror as her teammates began to describe visions the spores were sharing with them. They saw themselves returning to human colonies with samples of the organisms, spreading the spores to other worlds. They saw humanity joining with the spore network, becoming part of a galaxy-wide intelligence that would solve all problems and end all conflicts. But Elena's scientific training helped her see through the beautiful visions. The spores weren't offering partnership. They were offering slavery. They wanted to use human space travel to spread across the galaxy, taking control of every world they reached. Elena realized that her resistance to the spores' mental influence wasn't an accident. The spores had specifically requested her for this mission because they needed someone stable enough to collect them and return to populated space. They had been planning to use her as their delivery system to the rest of human civilization. The worst part was that her teammates genuinely believed the spores were trying to help them. The organisms were so skilled at mental manipulation that their victims felt grateful for being controlled. "Don't you see, Elena?" Sam asked, turning to look at her with eyes that no longer seemed completely human. "We don't have to struggle. Anymore. We don't have to make difficult decisions or worry about the future. The spores will take care of everything. Elena backed away from her teammates, her mind racing. She was now completely alone, surrounded by a planetary intelligence that had been planning this moment for years. Her friends had been turned against her, and she was running out of time to find a way to stop the spores from using her to spread across the galaxy. Looking at the perfect circle of glowing organisms, Elena realized she was facing something far more dangerous than a hostile planet. She was facing a patient, intelligent enemy that had been preparing for this confrontation longer than she had been alive. The spores pulsed brighter as if sensing her growing understanding, and Elena knew that the real battle for survival was just beginning. Elena's mind worked frantically as she watched her 3 teammates standing motionless around the spore circle. Their eyes had taken on a strange, distant look that told her they were no longer completely in control of their own thoughts. The spores were winning, and she was running out of time. She needed to find a weakness in the spore network, something the organisms hadn't planned for. Elena began thinking about everything she had learned during her years of studying extremophile organisms. These creatures had survived by adapting to impossible conditions, but every organism had limits. Looking at her equipment, Elena had an idea that was either brilliant or completely insane. The portable reactor they had brought to power their instruments was small, but it contained enough energy to create a massive electromagnetic pulse if she could overload it properly. The spores communicated through electromagnetic signals. If Elena could create a pulse strong enough to disrupt their network, it might break their control over her teammates and prevent them from spreading to other worlds. The only problem was that overloading the reactor would create an explosion large enough to destroy everything within several kilometers. Elena began working quietly, modifying the reactor's safety systems while keeping one eye on her teammates. They hadn't moved for several minutes, standing like statues around the glowing spores. Occasionally, one of them would nod or smile slightly, as if responding to a conversation only they could hear. "Elena," Maya called out suddenly, her voice eerily calm. "You need to stop what you're doing. The spores are trying to help us. Don't you want to be part of something bigger than yourself?" Elena continued working on the reactor, her hands steady despite her racing heart. "I want to remain human, Maya. That's all." Jake turned to look at her with eyes that seemed to glow with the same light as the spores. "Being human means suffering, Elena. The spores can take all that pain away. They can make us perfect." Elena realized that the spores were speaking through her teammates now, using their voices to try to convince her to stop her sabotage. It was working better than she wanted to admit. Hearing her friends' voices, even controlled by alien intelligence, made her hesitate. But then she remembered the warning message carved into the metal marker. "The spores are not what they seem. Don't trust them." Someone from a previous expedition had managed to resist long enough to leave that warning. Elena owed it to them to finish what they had started. The reactor modification was almost complete when Sam began walking toward her. His movement was smooth and purposeful, unlike his earlier confused stumbling. The spores were using him to stop her. "Elena," Sam said gently, "you're making a mistake. The spores have shown us the future. Humanity will spread across the galaxy, but not alone. We'll have guidance, protection, purpose. Isn't that what we've always wanted?" Elena backed away from Sam, still working on the reactor's control panel. "At what cost, Sam? Our freedom? Our ability to make our own choices?" "Freedom is an illusion," Jake said, joining Sam as they slowly approached her. "Choice is a burden. The spores offer something better: unity, peace, perfection." Elena felt tears running down her cheeks as she listened to her friends speak words that weren't their own. The spores were using everything they cared about against them, promising solutions to humanity's greatest problems. It was a tempting offer, and Elena could understand why so many expedition members had accepted it. But Elena had spent her entire career studying life at its most basic level. She knew that diversity, Adaptation and struggle were what made life strong. The perfect unity the spores offered was really just another form of death. Elena completed the reactor modification just as her teammates reached her. She looked into their faces one last time, hoping to see some trace of the people she had come to care about during their journey. "I'm sorry," she whispered, then activated the overload sequence. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The reactor began building toward a catastrophic discharge, but more importantly, it started producing powerful electromagnetic pulses that disrupted the spore's communication network. Elena watched as confusion returned to her teammates' faces. The distant, controlled expressions were replaced by looks of bewilderment and fear as their own minds were suddenly returned to them. "What happened?" Maya asked, shaking her head as if waking from a dream. "Where are we? Why do I feel so strange?" Elena grabbed her friends and pulled them away from the spore circle as quickly as possible. "We have about 3 minutes before this whole area becomes very dangerous. We need to find shelter." As they ran toward the crashed remains of an earlier expedition's shuttle, Elena explained what the spores had been doing to them. Her teammates listened in horror as they realized how close they had come to losing themselves completely. The reactor explosion, when it came, was visible from orbit. Elena and her team had taken shelter in the reinforced cabin of an old shuttle, just in time. The electromagnetic pulse that preceded the explosion swept across the entire planet, disrupting the spore network's communications for the first time in decades. In the silence that followed, Elena heard something she hadn't expected. The sound of another shuttle landing nearby. Captain Morrison had defied direct orders from the Galactic Research Council and come to rescue them. "Elena!" Morrison called out as he and his rescue team approached the damaged shuttle. "Are you alive in there?" Elena emerged from the wreckage, supporting Maya, who was still recovering from the spore's mental influence. Jake and Sam were shaken but able to walk. They were all alive, and more importantly, they were still human. The journey back to the Meridian was quiet. Elena's teammates were processing what had happened to them, trying to understand how they had been so completely controlled by alien organisms. Elena spent the time preparing her report for the Galactic Research Council, knowing that few people would believe the truth about Zarion Prime. She was right. When they returned to Earth, the Council initially tried to dismiss Elena's findings as the hallucinations of someone affected by the planet's atmosphere. They wanted to send another expedition to retrieve the spores, convinced that the medical benefits were worth the risk. But Elena had recorded everything. She had data showing the spores' planet-wide communication network, evidence of their ability to manipulate human thoughts, and proof that they had been influencing the Council's decisions for years. Most importantly, she had the testimonies of her 3 teammates, whose experiences supported everything she claimed. Elena took her evidence directly to the Galactic Senate, bypassing the Research Council entirely. Her testimony, combined with the overwhelming scientific evidence, convinced the senators to quarantine Zarion Prime permanently. No more expeditions would be sent to the planet, and the spores would remain isolated from the rest of the galaxy. The quarantine order saved countless lives, but Elena knew it was only a temporary solution. The spores were patient and intelligent. They would eventually find another way to spread beyond their planet. But for now, humanity was safe. Elena returned to her quiet laboratory work, but she was no longer the same person who had boarded the Meridian months earlier. She had seen what could happen when people blindly trusted authority figures and scientific institutions. She had learned that sometimes the greatest discoveries were also the greatest dangers. Elena became an advocate for transparency in scientific research and exploration. She spoke at universities and research facilities, warning young scientists about the importance of questioning everything, even when the answers seemed too good to be true. Sometimes late at night in her laboratory, Elena would look up at the stars and think about Zarion Prime. The planet was still out there, still waiting, still planning. The spores had been patient for decades before their first contact with humanity. They could afford to wait a few more decades for their next opportunity. But Elena was ready for them. She had dedicated her life to making sure that when the spores tried again, humanity would be prepared. The galaxy was a dangerous place, filled with wonders and terrors beyond imagination. But as long as people like Elena were watching, humanity would remain free to make its own choices, no matter how difficult those choices might be.